in the shadows of the Second World War. Beyond the headlines of D-Day, Stalingrad, and Hiroshima, there existed operations so secret, so morally compromised, that governments buried them under layers of silence and disinformation. What remains are fragments, yellowed files, intercepted cables, testimonies whispered by men who never should have spoken. These are not the stories of battlefield heroics or public victories. They are the forbidden operations, erased from textbooks, denied in parliaments, and censored from military reports. The public was never meant to know them. But once unearthed, they reveal a darker dimension to the war, where deception outweighed honor, where civilians became expendable subjects, and where the line between ally and enemy blurred into cold calculation. In damp archives and sealed intelligence vaults, names like Iron Wolf, Partition Accord, and Project Koryak appear in ink now smudged by time. Some files were deliberately destroyed, others were altered beyond recognition. Yet scattered references in Soviet memoranda, British Foreign Office logs, and American OSS dispatches testify to their reality. The shadows of these operations stretch across decades, into the Cold War and beyond, shaping the geopolitical world in ways historians rarely admit. What follows is not a celebration of victory, but a dissection of secrecy, a descent into the machinery of war stripped of its patriotic facade. These are the stories nations swore would never see daylight, yet somehow survived. 4 operations, 4 forbidden files, surfacing from the dark. The silence is breaking, and the truth demands to be heard. Chapter 1. Operation Iron Wolf. Deception Files. The autumn of 1943 was bitter across the Eastern Front. The Dnieper River became a line of blood and sacrifice, where advancing Soviet armies sought to liberate occupied Ukraine from retreating German forces. Official Soviet accounts describe a heroic crossing, with soldiers building makeshift rafts under enemy fire. But within NKVD archives, behind pages stamped Sovershcheno Sekretno, top secret, lies a file labeled simply Iron Wolf. Its contents suggest that the Germans did not merely defend the Dnieper. They orchestrated a deception so elaborate it cost tens of thousands of Soviet lives in a single campaign, and was later erased from the historical record. According to Gestapo file number 17, captured in Berlin in 1945, the Abwehr and remnants of Einsatzgruppen developed a last-ditch protocol to slow Soviet momentum. The operation, codenamed Eisenwolf, Iron Wolf, was designed as both tactical trap and psychological warfare. German operatives broadcast falsified surrender messages on captured Soviet frequencies, mimicked Red Army officers over the radio, and planted forged documents on dead German couriers. Their goal, to lure entire Soviet divisions into pre-arranged killing grounds near the marshes of Belarus and the floodplains of the Dnieper. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's 65th Army became the primary target. Soviet intelligence believed they were intercepting genuine communications from defecting German officers, promising safe passage across lightly defended river sectors. Orders came down from the front command to press forward quickly. Red Army sappers cleared paths into lowland areas, unaware that German artillery had already fixed coordinates. Hidden within the reeds and forests, 88mm guns and mortars waited, their barrels aligned on the only viable crossing points. The deception worked with brutal precision. On the night of October 12th, entire regiments advanced under the cover of mist. Once the first Soviet columns entered the marsh corridors, preset charges detonated beneath them, collapsing hastily built wooden pontoons. Thousands of soldiers drowned in freezing black water, dragged down by their own rifles and ammunition belts. Survivors scrambled toward the banks, only to be cut down by interlocking fields of machine gun fire. Artillery rained overhead, exploding the mud into geysers of earth and blood. The river crossing, described in Soviet textbooks, concealed a massacre engineered from the start. NKVD reports estimate over 20,000 Soviet troops vanished in that sector in less than 3 weeks. Yet, official wartime communiqué described losses only as normal attrition. Families received telegrams marked "missing in action," never acknowledging the deception that consumed their sons. Stalin himself, briefed by intelligence officers who suspected foul play, ordered silence. To admit the trap was to admit weakness in Soviet counterintelligence, a stain unacceptable to the mythology of the Great Patriotic War. Fragments of evidence continued to surface in the decades that followed. In 1967, During an internal review of military records, a colonel in the Soviet General Staff referenced Iron Wolf casualties in a handwritten margin note. The page was swiftly classified and sealed. In the 1980s, Polish dissidents discovered microfilm hidden in church archives in Lublin, detailing intercepted German transmissions that matched those described in Gestapo file number 17. The microfilm vanished 2 weeks later, seized by state security officers. Witnesses to the event claimed the agents carried KGB credentials. One chilling testimony survives from Lieutenant Pyotr Malishev, recorded in 1946 but not published until after his death in 1979. His voice, shaky, described the night crossing. The river was quiet, almost beautiful, but something was wrong. We were told the Germans had abandoned the far bank. Yet when the 1st Battalion moved forward, the earth itself exploded. I saw comrades torn apart before they reached the water. We had walked into their jaws like lambs. His words were redacted in official transcripts, yet his personal notebook, smuggled out by family members, preserved the memory. The psychological impact of Iron Wolf extended beyond casualties. Soviet soldiers began to distrust radio orders, fearing they originated from German forgeries. Commanders hesitated to act quickly, haunted by the memory of men lost in unseen traps. The Wehrmacht had achieved its aim, buying time, instilling doubt, and ensuring that Soviet advances were slowed despite overwhelming numbers. Although the Germans would ultimately retreat, Iron Wolf inflicted wounds not measured in territory, but in the corrosive erosion of trust between Soviet high command and its own intelligence apparatus. Western historians stumbled upon fragments of the operation during the Cold War. In 1952, CIA analysts reviewing captured German archives noted inconsistencies in Soviet accounts of the Dnieper battles. A declassified memorandum titled Operation Eisenwolf, Assessment of Soviet Losses, detailed suspected casualty figures far higher than Moscow admitted. The document was filed under psychological operations and shelved, considered too explosive to reveal during an era when Soviet propaganda painted an unbroken chain of heroism. Washington preferred silence, lest the truth be weaponized in unpredictable ways. Today, the marshlands along the Dnieper bear no monuments to Iron Wolf. The bones of soldiers remain buried beneath silt and reeds, unmarked and unnamed. Families still search for answers to telegrams that declared their sons missing. In Belarusian villages, old men whisper of nights when the sky burned red and the river stank of cordite. Yet official Russian military histories continue to omit the word Iron Wolf. It exists only in scattered archives, in the margins of forgotten reports, and in the memories of those who survived what was never meant to be acknowledged. Operation Iron Wolf was more than a battlefield deception. It was a study in silence, how governments can bury truth to preserve myths, how archives can be locked to protect reputations, and how tens of thousands of human lives can be reduced to a single phrase: normal attrition. The file remains classified in Moscow to this day, with researchers denied access under the pretext of national security. The wolf sleeps still, its growl audible only to those willing to listen beyond the pages of official history. Chapter 2. The Churchill-Stalin Partition Accord. In the late autumn of 1944, when the world's attention focused on the Allied push toward Germany and the bloody struggle for control of the Ardennes, a quieter battle was taking place behind locked doors and encoded telegrams. This was no clash of armies, no storming of beaches or artillery barrage. It was a war of pens, whispers, and shadow treaties. Hidden beneath the official agreements that history remembers, Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, lay a darker document, an understanding never meant for public eyes. It would later be whispered of as the Partition Accord, a clandestine arrangement between Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin that redrew the map of Eastern Europe years before the guns fell. Silent, the Partition Accord was not signed in marble, halls, or beneath the flashbulbs of journalists. Instead, it existed in fragments, scribbled percentages on a scrap of paper, delivered through couriers, concealed inside innocuous trade cables, and disguised as routine diplomatic correspondence. In Moscow, October 1944, Churchill arrived to meet Stalin in the Kremlin. Official accounts speak of their percentages agreement, where they divided spheres of influence in places like Romania, Greece, and Yugoslavia. But hidden beneath this already controversial exchange was a far grimmer concession: an understanding that the Balkans would be surrendered to Soviet control in exchange for British access to vital oil reserves in the Middle East. The deal, never ratified openly, condemned entire nations to 4 decades of occupation behind the Iron Curtain. In Whitehall, only a handful of officials saw even a hint of the arrangement. Files marked "most secret" for the Prime Minister's eyes only referred obliquely to long-term guarantees of supply and strategic accommodation with Eastern interests. Churchill's private secretary, John Colville, wrote in his diary of documents burned immediately after use, in accordance with standing orders. Colville noted with unease that Churchill himself described the discussion with Stalin as the most cynical transaction of my life. Nothing further was recorded. In Washington, the Office of Strategic Services intercepted fragments of cable traffic, suggesting unusual negotiations between London and Moscow. An OSS memorandum from November 1944, declassified decades later, warned bluntly, "The exclusion of American oversight in these agreements presents a grave threat to our post-war position in Europe. British willingness to concede the Balkans condemns the region to Soviet servitude." President Roosevelt, ill and distracted in the final months of his life, was never formally briefed. The United States entered the post-war era blind to the shadow line already drawn across Europe. The Partition Accord's language was simple but devastating. Romania, 90% Soviet, 10% British. Bulgaria, 75% Soviet, 25% British. Hungary, 80% Soviet, 20% British. Greece, 90% British, 10% Soviet. Yugoslavia, divided equally. On the surface, it appeared a crude attempt to balance influence, but hidden in back channels, additional concessions were made. Romania's oil fields, seized by the Soviets, were guaranteed as part of a supply corridor to fuel British naval power in the Mediterranean. In exchange, Moscow demanded and received silence on Soviet expansion deeper into Central Europe. The deal was not a blueprint for peace. It was a carving knife, driven into the heart of nations without their consent. Ordinary people across the Balkans paid the price. Romanian resistance groups, who had risen against fascist occupation, discovered after 1945 that their supposed liberation brought only NKVD repression. Bulgarian intellectuals who had once hoped for independence were purged as Soviet-aligned parties seized control. Hungarian officers who dreamed of neutrality were branded traitors. The Partition Accord had ensured that these outcomes were not accidents of war, but prearranged sacrifices on a diplomatic altar. For decades, the existence of the accord remained buried. Soviet historians never acknowledged it, dismissing Western claims as capitalist propaganda. In Britain, the Foreign Office sealed relevant documents under the Official Secrets Act, restricting access until well into the 21st century. Even when Churchill, in his memoirs, alluded vaguely to a naughty document passed between him and Stalin, he presented it as a casual improvisation, a scrap of paper tossed aside. But archival evidence suggests otherwise. Copies of the naughty document were not destroyed. They were preserved in Soviet archives, stamped, catalogued, and filed away for potential use as blackmail. In 1989, as the Soviet Union began to fracture, fragments of the Partition Accord surfaced. A young archivist in Moscow, sympathetic to reform, leaked microfilm copies of Foreign Office correspondence referencing the percentages to contacts in the West. The documents were smuggled through Poland, hidden in false-bottomed suitcases, and eventually reached London. Their authenticity was quietly verified, but official acknowledgement never came. The British government insisted the material was inconclusive. Researchers who pressed the issue found themselves blocked at every turn, their requests for access denied under vague claims of national security. The Partition Accord, though obscured, shaped the reality of the Cold War. When Soviet tanks crushed the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, British diplomats offered little protest beyond rhetoric. When Czechoslovakia was invaded in 1968, silence from London spoke volumes. Behind each muted response lay the shadow of that earlier deal. London had traded principle for access, liberty for oil. Stalin's empire had been legitimized not only by force of arms but by the tacit consent of his supposed allies. What lingers today is the unsettling recognition that the war's victors did not simply defeat fascism. They also chose which nations would live free and which would remain shackled. For Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary, the outcome was not determined solely by battlefield struggles or the will of their people. It was determined in a Kremlin office in October 1944, when two men drew percentages on a piece of paper and consigned millions to generations of repression. The Partition Accord was not merely a cynical bargain, it was the blueprint of the Iron Curtain, a line drawn before the war even ended, hidden behind smiles and handshakes at official conferences. It remains a forbidden chapter in the story of World War II, a document that should never have existed, yet continues to haunt the lives of nations once reduced to fractions in the margin of a secret agreement. Chapter 3: Japan's Unit 731, Arctic Experiments. Among the most horrifying secrets of the Second World War lies the legacy of Japan's Unit 731, the notorious biological warfare division stationed in Harbin, Manchuria. Its atrocities, vivisections, plague bombs, and mass experimentation on prisoners of war have been whispered about for decades. Yet buried deeper in restricted archives of the US Army's Biological Warfare Division is a chapter even darker and far less known. This file, labeled Project Koryak, describes experiments carried out not in the fields of Manchuria, but in the frozen wastelands of Siberia during late 1944. The purpose? To create pathogens capable of surviving sub-zero conditions, ensuring biological weapons could be deployed across the Arctic, against both Soviet and American targets. Project Koryak began when Japanese intelligence identified abandoned gulag camps along the Kolyma River basin. The locations, once controlled by the NKVD, had been left desolate following mass evacuations in the early years of the war. With covert cooperation from rogue elements within the Kwantung Army, Japanese scientists were transported by submarine and overland smuggling routes into the Siberian frontier. Witnesses later testified to a convoy of blacked-out trucks moving north from Harbin, guarded by Kempeitai officers, carrying crates of sealed glass canisters, medical instruments, and bound prisoners, Chinese, Mongolian, and captured Soviet soldiers. The facilities were primitive: wooden barracks, steel doors reinforced with ice, rooms converted into crude laboratories with kerosene lamps flickering in the frozen air. Yet within these walls, some of the most inhumane tests of the war unfolded. Prisoners were stripped naked and forced into outdoor pens as temperatures plunged below -40. They were injected with experimental viral cocktails designed to mimic influenza, anthrax, and plague, but altered with frost-resistant enzymes harvested from Arctic soil microbes. The goal was simple: create a pathogen that would not die in cold climates but thrive, weaponized against entire northern populations. According to declassified Soviet memoranda, NKVD border units intercepted rumors of Japanese activity near the Chukotka Peninsula in December 1944. Reports describe unusual lighting seen in abandoned gulag zones and suspicious tracks leading from the coast inland, but Stalin's high command, already stretched thin by the German front, chose silence. Internal notes suggest that rather than risk direct confrontation, Soviet officials saw potential value in the Japanese research. Orders were issued: observe, do not engage, intelligence priority, scientific output. This chilling directive effectively condemned the prisoners of Project Koryak to their fate. Testimony from post-war interrogations reveals the unimaginable. Survivors among the Japanese staff admitted that prisoners were locked in airtight chambers while aerosolized agents were released, then left for days to observe progress of infection. Others were forced to march barefoot through snow after deliberate frostbite exposure, their gangrenous limbs later amputated without anesthesia, organs harvested for study. Entire groups were executed and buried in mass graves beneath permafrost, the sites chosen specifically to preserve tissue for later retrieval. No prisoner survived. The tundra became both laboratory and graveyard. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the question arose: what became of Project Koryak's records? In occupied Japan, American authorities seized Unit 731 documentation wholesale, offering immunity to war criminals in exchange for scientific data. Most of these deals centered on the atrocities in Manchuria, but hidden within the stacks of seized files, a series of sealed folders marked Koryak field trials were quietly removed and transferred to Fort Detrick, Maryland, home of the US Biological Warfare Program. There, the data was classified top secret, eyes only. Publicly, the United States condemned Japan's war crimes at the Tokyo Tribunal. Privately, they concealed evidence, calculating that the value of Arctic pathogen research outweighed the moral outrage. Soviet authorities, too, kept their silence. In 1947, NKVD officers interrogated Japanese captives who had participated in Koryak, yet the transcripts were sealed in Moscow under the designation Особой важности, of special importance. Soviet interest was not in prosecution but replication. Cold War files suggest that Koryak's findings influenced later Soviet biological programs at Sverdlovsk and Omutninsk, where research into frost-resistant anthrax spores quietly advanced in parallel with American efforts. Both superpowers, enemies on paper, had inherited the horrors of Unit 731 and buried them in steel vaults. One of the few glimpses into Project Koryak came in 1956, during a closed-door session of the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on National Security. A senator, referencing unnamed sources, warned of Japanese wartime experiments in Siberia, their data now in our possession, their application unthinkable. The transcript was immediately classified. It would not resurface until the 1990s, when researchers pried loose fragments through Freedom of Information requests. Even then, entire pages remained redacted, black ink hiding the names of those who ensured the project stayed hidden. Visual motifs recur in every surviving description. The endless whiteness of snowfields, broken only by wooden watchtowers, the glow of lanterns on frostbitten faces, the hiss of pressurized canisters opening in silence, the moans of dying prisoners swallowed by the howl of Arctic winds. In the rare notes left by Japanese technicians, one sentence appears again and again: "The cold does not forgive." For them, the tundra was not only a testing ground, it was a weapon in itself. The legacy of Project Koryak lives on in shadows. No memorials mark the burial pits along the Kolyma Basin. Maps of the region omit references to abandoned gulag sites. Both Russian and American governments continue to deny possession of related research. Yet hints surface in unexpected places. An American military report on low-temperature resistant viral carriers, a Soviet epidemiological study citing unique data from foreign sources, and survivor testimonies from local Chukchi hunters who stumbled upon rows of skeletal remains bound in rusted wire. The truth exists not in a single document, but in the scattered echoes of secrecy that refuse to fade. Project Koryak demonstrates the terrifying convergence of science and cruelty when nations pursue absolute power. It was not merely an extension of Unit 731's horrors. It was an escalation, an attempt to weaponize the climate itself, to turn winter into an ally of extermination. The silence maintained by both Washington and Moscow proves its significance. For decades, these records remained locked away, not because they lacked credibility, but because they contained knowledge too dangerous to reveal. The cold even now keeps its secrets, and beneath the ice of Siberia, the graves of Project Koryak still wait in silence, preserved in frost, bearing witness to a crime history refuses to confront. Chapter 4. The Dresden Gas Protocol Cover-Up. Dresden, February 1945. The name alone evokes visions of firestorms, of a Baroque city reduced to ashes in a single night of Allied bombing. Official histories speak of incendiaries, high explosives, and hurricane-force winds that consumed thousands of civilians in cellars and shelters. Yet within heavily redacted RAF Bomber Command memoranda and restricted American chemical warfare files lies a darker suggestion that Dresden's annihilation was not accomplished by fire alone. Among fragments of intercepted German communications and the testimonies of stunned survivors runs a chilling phrase: unknown aerosol compound. This phrase, repeated in decrypted GCHQ reports, forms the basis of what became known in closed circles as the Dresden Gas Protocol, an allegation so devastating that it has been suppressed for over 70 years. The official record describes Operation Thunderclap, the Allied plan to break German morale through massive urban destruction. On the night of February 13, 1945, more than 800 British bombers flew over Dresden, dropping thousands of tons of explosives and incendiaries. Fire consumed the city centre, temperatures reached over 1,500 degrees, and oxygen was sucked from underground shelters. But survivors emerging from basements after the raids reported something else. Hundreds of corpses lying in the tunnels without burns, their bodies stiff, and their skin marked with lesions more consistent with chemical exposure than fire. German civil defense officers, transmitting desperate reports to Berlin, noted a choking vapor, colorless, spreading in low levels through the shelters. These messages, decrypted by Allied codebreakers, were not included in post-war intelligence summaries. Instead, they were classified under a new heading: Protocol 17, Dresden Reports. Within RAF files declassified in fragments during the 1990s, researchers uncovered references to special ordnance dispersal tested under combat conditions. The language was vague, the technical details removed. Yet one surviving sentence remained legible: experimental dispersal succeeded beyond expectation. Analysts cross-referenced these notes with US Army chemical warfare service logs and found a curious alignment. In January 1945, requisitions for aerosol canisters, phosphor-boron compound, were signed out under American authority, shipped through Allied bases in southern England. The canisters were logged as training material, but their quantities far exceeded any plausible exercise. Weeks later, Dresden burned, and whispers of the gas protocol began. The rationale, as reconstructed from scattered files, was strategic experimentation. Allied planners feared the possibility of urban warfare against Japan, where chemical dispersal into underground fortifications could prove decisive. Dresden, a city filled with refugees with no major anti-air defenses, presented a grotesque opportunity: a living laboratory hidden beneath the chaos of a massive bombing campaign. Survivors' accounts describe shelters where entire families collapsed without warning, clutching at their throats, their skin blistering despite never touching flames. Fire alone could not explain such scenes. American officers at the scene, part of an advanced intelligence team, compiled photographs of the dead. These images, later discovered in a restricted collection at the National Archives, were marked not for release. Bodies bore signs of pulmonary edema and chemical burns inconsistent with phosphorus exposure. German doctors in surviving hospitals collected samples from victims, but these were seized by occupying forces weeks later. The doctors' protests vanished into silence. In trial records of the Nuremberg Tribunal, any mention of Dresden beyond strategic bombing losses was struck from testimony, excised by Allied prosecutors who refused to open the door to questions of chemical warfare. For decades, German survivor groups spoke quietly of the gas shelters. Their testimonies were dismissed as hysteria, propaganda, or the confusion of war. Yet within the walls of GCHQ, intelligence officers filed away Dresden's radio reports under the codename Protocol 17. A retired analyst, speaking anonymously in the 1980s, admitted, "We all knew something was unusual. The Germans were describing deaths inconsistent with firestorm physics. But policy was clear. This was never to reach the public record. Dresden was our victory. No blemish could be tolerated." The British government defended its silence under the Official Secrets Act. Inquiries into Dresden's destruction were carefully limited to bombing tonnage, casualty figures, and architectural loss. When journalists pressed for details in the 1970s, officials pointed to incendiary saturation as the sole explanation. Files that might have proved otherwise remained sealed, stamped closed until 2045. In the United States, Fort Detrick housed a parallel collection labeled Allied Field Trials, 1944-45. Researchers granted partial access decades later reported entire boxes missing, removed without record of transfer. What makes the Dresden gas protocol so insidious is its deliberate concealment. While firebombing itself was justified by Allied leaders as a military necessity, chemical dispersal violated international law. The 1925 Geneva Protocol had explicitly banned the use of gas in war. To admit that Allied forces tested chemical weapons on a civilian population, even under the cover of bombing, would have shattered the moral high ground on which post-war narratives rested. Thus, silence became policy. Silence, reinforced by classification, denial, and the destruction of records. The protocol's shadow lingers in the city itself. Beneath Dresden's rebuilt streets lie old basements where families once sought safety. Archaeologists excavating in the 1990s reported unusual residues on masonry walls, chlorinated compounds not typical of incendiary residue. Their findings were quietly redirected, samples confiscated by officials before publication. Locals speak of certain tunnels sealed permanently after the war, declared unsafe due to structural instability. Yet those who worked on the closures recall men in protective suits, removing soil and debris under strict supervision, never explaining what had been found. Dresden's ruins conceal more than fire. They conceal a crime unacknowledged by history. A field trial executed against a civilian population under the guise of legitimate bombing. The gas protocol remains one of the most closely guarded secrets of World War II. Its fragments survive only in redacted memos, survivor whispers, and the sealed vaults of Allied archives. To this day, no government has admitted its existence. Yet the unanswered questions persist, like smoke that refuses to clear. Why were bodies found unburned, yet asphyxiated? Why were intercepted German messages classified as Protocol 17? And why do archives on Dresden remain sealed for a century? The Dresden Gas Protocol represents the ultimate betrayal of trust between governments and the truth. It reveals that even in the final months of a war fought in the name of liberty, experimentation trumped morality, and civilians became unwilling test subjects in the laboratories of destruction. Official history insists Dresden was a firestorm. The classified record whispers otherwise. Somewhere between the two lies the truth, a truth still locked away in vaults, waiting for the day when silence can no longer bury it. The forbidden stories of Iron Wolf, the Partition Accord, Project Koryak, and the Dresden Gas Protocol reveal not only the brutality of war, but the lengths to which governments will go to protect secrets. Each file, each fragment of testimony, exposes a truth carefully hidden behind locked cabinets and redacted pages. These were not mere battlefield maneuvers, but operations that blurred the line between strategy and atrocity. Campaigns where deception, betrayal, and experimentation replaced honor. The men who orchestrated them are gone, yet their shadows stretch across decades. Soldiers marched into marshes that became mass graves. Nations were traded in fractions on scraps of paper. Prisoners froze in Siberian camps turned laboratories. Civilians suffocated in shelters beneath a city consumed by fire and silence. History books omit these operations not because they are unimportant, but because they are too damning, too corrosive to the myths of victory. Still, fragments survive. Intercepted cables, marginal notes, survivor testimonies, and redacted files marked top secret. Together, they form a mosaic of forbidden history. The question that remains is chilling. How many more such files lie buried, hidden in archives, their contents waiting for another generation to uncover? If these 4 operations could remain concealed for nearly a century, what other truths still slumber in darkness? The silence is deliberate. The erasure is intentional. And yet, as long as even a single document remains, the secrets of the Second World War cannot be fully buried. The past speaks, even from sealed vaults. The only question is, who will listen?